This presentation is about problem-based learning. What is problem-based learning? Problem-based learning, also known as PBL, is a teaching method that encourages learners to obtain and apply content knowledge, as well as to develop critical thinking and problem learning skills to deal with real-world issues. When we think about it, it's next to impossible for students or learners to learn all there is to know in such small amounts of time. PBL teaches a learner to independently identify, formulate, and solve problems, as well as gather and access knowledge critically. This method encourages a learner to continue learning throughout time, not just in this moment, but it teaches the learner how to learn independently in the future and throughout their careers. One of PBL's main goals is to improve clinical reasoning, which promotes problem-solving skills and critical thinking. Lifelong skills taught during PBL include critical thinking, teamwork, creativity, problem-solving, leadership, and communication. So at the start of learning, when you're using PBL, a problem is presented to the learners. And then the learners proactively solve this problem presented to them, and that's how they learn the information they need to know by solving the problem. So this is a learner-led education. The learner must apply acquired learning to solve these problems. How does it apply to the different domains of learning? PBL applies to all three domains of learning. I'm going to start with cognitive or the thinking domain. Cognitive or thinking domain involves the acquisition of information and addresses the development of the learner's intellectual abilities, mental capacities, understanding, and thinking processes. So PBL encourages the learner to use prior knowledge to solve a problem and acquire new knowledge that can easily be recalled later. It's so easy to recall because the learner is actively learning during this process. It's hands-on and they're doing it themselves. No one's lecturing them or telling them what to memorize. They're having to work through a problem, which makes it easier later to recall because you have experienced this issue or problem before. PBL also expands the learner's critical thinking abilities and problem-solving skills. The learner must critically think to get through this problem and also obviously learn to use problem-solving skills, so it helps expand and develop those critical thinking abilities. So an example of how PBL relates to cognitive is, say, in simulation nursing staff, they already have prior traditional lectured knowledge about arrhythmias and how to care for a patient experiencing an arrhythmia. But in simulation, a nurse is required to recall that prior knowledge and expand upon it by reacting and treating based off of the presenting symptoms and that scenario. Like different symptoms can be presented with similar arrhythmias, different arrhythmias, and it's just problems being thrown at you, and you have to actively, in that moment, work through the different scenarios. Second domain of learning, affective or the feeling domain, involves an increasing internalization or commitment to feelings expressed as emotions, interests, beliefs, attitudes, values, and appreciations. This domain includes emotional and social development goals. So PBL relates to this because it helps develop learners' communication skills. One of the biggest complaints and shortcomings that nursing students or new nursing professionals express is difficulty communicating with other staff, other professionals. So there's different PBL activities like practicing SBAR and such things like that. And even just being in a simulation where you have to communicate with the group who's in the simulation with you, assigned a role, and you might have to call the doctor or the lab. Enhances your communication skills. PBL also provides learners with an internal desire to learn because you got to get through this problem. You need to work through it. It's your own drive to solve the problem. No one's telling you you need to learn this or memorize this. It's your own internal drive to get through the problem. So for an example, in a simulation group of learners, they're assigned a role and presented the problem. They must come together and solve the problem that they are facing. This enhances communication skills with other healthcare professionals. The last domain of learning, psychomotor, or the skills domain, involves acquiring fine and gross motor abilities that use increasing complexity of neuromuscular coordination to carry out physical movement. So PBL allows the learner to gain and enhance their knowledge with hands-on education. The learner is leading the education. This is very hands-on psychomotor type of domain using skills. PBL, like psychomotor, is a different style, a different approach to teaching with different evaluation methods, such as afterwards you debrief and you talk about what went well, what could have went better, what did you learn, what did you take away from it. You're able to maybe watch a recording of yourself in simulation and what others were doing and how the group came together and what role you played. And there's just different ways of evaluating education. You can see how much you've actually learned in real time when you're able to apply the traditional knowledge you had and you brought it to the table when you were faced with a problem and you had to perform a skill. So my example for this is in simulation of a mock code, the nursing staff has to use prior knowledge and their gross and fine motor skills to save the simulator's life. You have to initiate CPR, maintain the airway, placing the patient on a monitor, possibly administering meds. All of these are using skills and knowledge all tied into one. Pros and cons of PBL. Pros, it's long-lasting retention. You're not memorizing anything. You're presented with a problem, you have to solve it, and then it leads to better retention and recall later because you've experienced it yourself and you've had to work through it. It was an internal drive to gain the knowledge. It's learner-centered. The learning can occur in a safe environment. You can feel free to make mistakes. Encourages teamwork, which is important in the healthcare field, and you actively acquire new knowledge. You bring your old and you learn new all in one. Some of the cons are that it can be successful or unsuccessful depending on the learner's willingness to participate in the learning experience. So what you put in is what you get out of it, basically, which can be a bad thing because if the learners aren't willing to participate, not much might come out of it. It's non-traditional, so some people don't like it and it requires adaptation. I know a lot of students complain about simulation, they don't like it. So it might take some adaptation from people and acceptance, which then can also hinder the participation. Requires some prior knowledge. You're thrown a problem and you need to at least have some basic knowledge to be able to solve this problem. And the other con I found was facilitators, which from personal experience, simulation, a facilitator can really change how the simulation goes if depending on their experience, how much they participate, how much knowledge they have about the content can really change how the simulation goes. And this is just a graph showing how traditional learning compares to problem-based learning. So traditional learning, you're told what you need to know, you need to memorize it, and then you're given a problem and you need to use what you were told to memorize. Whereas problem-based, you're assigned a problem, you have to identify yourself what you need to know, and then you learn and you apply it to solve that original problem you were presented. So these are examples of how we can apply problem-based learning to healthcare education. My first example I use teaching a patient. So say this patient's newly diagnosed with diabetes mellitus type 2. You give handouts, you give verbal education, and then at a later time you come back and you present the patient with a problem such as, okay, today's a sick day. What's important to know? So the patient should independently solve this problem or use who's going to be their support system or family members. They should use the resources you gave them as long as they know where to access the answers, that's good, but we want to try and allow them to independently solve the problem without us telling them the knowledge, which is then just information they need to memorize. Two other examples are simulation, like I've been using throughout the presentation to educate our healthcare professionals. So different scenarios are like mock codes, arrhythmia care, stroke care, giving them a problem, using different symptoms and scenarios and allowing those professionals to work through the problem to come up with an answer. Either it's bad or good, but we can learn from what we did in that room. Another example is debate. So you can present a case study to a group of professionals and they can debate and go back and forth about diagnosis and treatment and care plans and different things. How should we teach this person and who should be involved? And, debate is healthy and being hands-on and you're presented a problem and need to solve it. And these are my references.